Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today we are talking all about the keto diet. I know this diet is very popular right now, so we're gonna go over what it is, how it works, and if it might be a good fit for you or not. I do have a whole podcast episode on the keto diet with my co-host Emily, so if you want to hear Emily's thoughts as well as more of my thoughts on this diet, I'll include the link to that below. It is a really good episode, so I recommend checking that out. And before I start, I do want to say that just in general, if a diet works for you, go for it. I got some backlash on my Optavia video that I did because people really like that diet and they say that it works for them. So as a dietitian, I talk about the pros and the cons, and I'm all about all foods fit, no foods off limits, because restriction often does just lead to more negatives than positives in the long run. But if a diet does work for you, go for it. That's great. There's no one size fits all solution for whatever your goals are, and that's why nutrition is so complicated. And as a dietitian, it makes it difficult to sometimes help people with their goals because it's a lot of trial and error in finding what will work. But just in general, as a whole, I have seen over and over again that restriction, whether that is in the form of a very low calorie diet like Optavia, or if it's eliminating carbs like in the keto diet, which we'll get to today, I just in general do see that that leads to more harm than good. And so I often don't make that, where I would start in the treatment or in working with one of my clients. But hey, again, if something works for you, that's great. You know your body best. It is all about what you enjoy doing and what you're gonna be able to stick to long term, so stick with it. There really is no one size fits all solution. Every single person needs their own approach. But that being said, let's get into this episode. All right, so I wanna first start by talking about what the keto diet is, kind of defining it. So the ketogenic diet is a very high fat, very low carb, moderate protein diet. So in terms of those three macronutrients, it's kind of split in the following way. Typically those following the diet are eating about 65 to 75% of their calories from fat, and usually less than 5% of their calories from carbs, and about 15 to 20% of their calories from protein. Now, how this kind of differs from like the typical diet is we usually have about 45 to 65% of our calories from carbs, a little lower in fat, so more like 20 to 35% fat, and anywhere from like 10 to 35% protein. So you can kind of see that on the keto diet, the carbs and the fat kind of flop, and we have a lot more fat, a lot less carbs. And the reason for that, the reason why people do that for this diet is to kind of switch the source that we use for energy. We typically use carbs for energy. The goal of the keto diet is to put the body into ketosis, which is where you use fat for energy instead of carbs. Now, I do want to point out there is a difference between the ketogenic diet and a low carb diet. So the keto diet is very low carb, usually about less than 50 grams of carbs per day. Typically, if you're eating more than that, you probably aren't even getting into ketosis. So that's why it's important to differentiate between keto and low carb, because low carb is anywhere from like 50 to 150 grams of carbs per day, depending on the person and how many total calories they're eating. But if you are doing a low carb diet, not really keto, you probably aren't getting into ketosis. And so you probably aren't using just fat for energy. And it also takes days to get into ketosis. Say one day you do go over your carb limit for the day and you have, say a peanut butter and jelly for lunch. You're gonna be way over on your carbs for the day, and your body will no longer be into ketosis. Or maybe say, you have a cheat day because you love carbs and you're eating so very low carb that you just feel restricted and want to have a cheat day so that you can incorporate those foods here and there. not only does that develop a very poor relationship with food, but it also is going to take you out of ketosis with that one cheat day. Take you days to get back into ketosis if you are following a very strict carbohydrate intake after that. So the whole point of me saying all this is that you have to be very strict with it if you actually do want to be in ketosis, because our body is going to try very hard to resist being in that ketotic state. And so any excess carbs that it gets, it's going to want to use those for energy instead of the fat that we're eating instead. So foods that are usually a staple in the keto diet are avocado and bacon, heavy cream, butter, nuts and seeds and oils, meat, fish, things that are very low carb, if not like no carbs. So foods that you would not be able to have on this diet are grains like bread, rice, pasta. You can't have your starchy vegetables like corn, potatoes, and peas. Milk is typically not allowed because milk is a carb-containing food. No fruits, no cereals, no sweets like cookies and brownies and ice cream. So there are quite a few foods that are not allowed on the keto diet because a lot of food has carbs in it, because again, carbs are a staple nutrient typically. So right off the bat, I do want to say if you are limiting those foods, your whole grains, your starchy vegetables, your fruits, you're missing out on a lot of fiber. And that is why I hear all the time from patients and clients that have done the keto diet that they struggle with constipation. And it's because most of the foods they're eating have little to no fiber in it. And most of us don't get enough fiber as it is, keto diet or not. Being keto definitely makes that worse for a lot of people. We usually need around like 25 to 35 grams of fiber per day, and that can be pretty hard to do if you're just eating things like meat and cheese and butter and bacon, you know. I know there's more to it than that in keto, and they do have those like keto breads that are super high in fiber, so they can count it as being low in net carbs. But in general, the keto diet is pretty low fiber, so constipation can be a struggle for that. Okay, so I want to go through how being on the keto diet sort of influences different disease states. So obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular health. I want to kind of break down the pros and cons of being on the keto diet in relation to those diseases. So as we all know, keto is currently being used as a weight loss tool or a weight loss diet, but keto was originally created to be a treatment for epilepsy in children or seizures in children. And how it usually works in that case is that it's prescribed by a doctor, and then it is very closely monitored by a healthcare team, usually including the doctor and dietitian. And the reason it has to be so closely monitored is because, like I kind of said earlier, if you aren't eating the right amount of carbs and right amount of fat, or even protein, we'll get to how gluconeogenesis works in a minute. If you aren't eating the right types of macronutrients, you won't be in ketosis, and then it will kind of be pointless. You'll just be restricting yourself for no reason. And I'm willing to bet that most people aren't being monitored by a doctor to make sure they are doing the keto diet right. So that goes back to what I said kind of earlier, that eating low carb is different from following the keto diet. So you need to make sure you are doing that correctly if you are following this diet and want to see the benefits that everyone raves about. And that being said, the effects of keto on weight loss are typically shown via anecdotal evidence. There isn't really a whole lot of evidence to support it currently as a long-term treatment for the disease that we know as obesity. It does make sense that it works for weight loss, at least in the short term, so I kind of want to describe how that works. Right off the bat, you're getting rid of an entire macronutrient, carbs, and so it makes sense that you would lose weight just because you're getting rid of such a large food group. You're not having bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, you're not having fruit anymore typically, unless you're eating, I know berries are sometimes allowed on the diet. So a lot of staple foods that you may currently have are no longer allowed, and so that typically leads to weight loss in itself just by cutting the calories that you're eating. But usually when one starts doing the keto diet, they have that very rapid weight loss in the beginning. And this is usually just water weight in the beginning. It's very challenging to lose that much fat mass in the beginning of any diet. And also, if we lose weight too quickly, it can often be muscle mass as well. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The reason that going keto leads to such rapid weight loss in the beginning is because of water weight. That's true. So the reason why that happens is because our glycogen stores are depleted. So glycogen is how carbs are stored in our body, and glycogen is largely composed of water. So when our body gets rid of all those glycogen stores, all those carbohydrate stores, if you will, all the water goes with it. And that's what that initial jump in weight loss is. It's just our glycogen stores being depleted, aka a lot of water is being lost. So again, that initial rapid weight loss when following this diet is not a lot of fat, it's mostly water. And that's why sometimes when doing this diet, your weight loss kind of plateaus or even increases after this initial jump, because glycogen stores can renew and that water weight can return. And it's good to have water weight. Our body wants that glycogen stored for energy. So having that initial loss of water weight isn't really a good thing. We want our body to be composed of a lot of water. We of course want to lose mainly fat mass. And the best way to lose body fat while keeping on our healthy water weight and by also maintaining our muscle mass, which we of course want to keep all of that we can, is by doing it slow and sustainable and steady and just through a slight caloric deficit. If we're losing too much too quick, it often isn't going to be A, sustainable, or B, mainly fat mass. So to kind of sum up keto's effects on weight loss, it does work, especially in the short term, but there's very little evidence to show long-term success with this diet. It is just a short-term solution, a band-aid, a quick fix that often leads to weight regain and a lot of sadness because you're missing out on the best food group ever. Okay, next let's talk about the keto diet and cardiovascular health. So again, tricky because there is limited long-term evidence. Some evidence does show that this diet does help with obesity. Like I was saying earlier, it can help, at least in the short term, and it can also show improvements in type 2 diabetes, which we'll get to in a minute. But by improving obesity and type 2 diabetes comorbidities, that can help better cardiovascular health. However, on the other hand, since this diet typically is so high in saturated fat, or not so healthy fat that's found in things like butter and fatty meats, and coconut oil is another big one that people are often surprised about as being a saturated fat. Some evidence does also show worsened LDL, which is our bad cholesterol, and increases in triglycerides. And having too much LDL and too much triglycerides floating around in our blood can lead to cardiovascular disease. So basically, it's hard to say right now the effect of this diet on cardiovascular health, but just in general, a diet so high in those unhealthy fats, those saturated fats, is well known to be poor for our heart health. And also, like I mentioned earlier with fiber can help lower our cholesterol. So again, that can also lead to heart problems as well. I do quickly want to touch on the keto diet and type 2 diabetes. This is also very controversial. I have so many patients and clients that have come to me and said their doctor put them on a keto diet. And the biggest reason I find that problematic is sometimes practitioners will just say, okay, do keto, and then they kind of boot you out of the office and you're left to kind of fend for yourself. And maybe what they mean is do a low carb diet, and even that usually requires the help of a dietitian to make sure you do know what foods have carbs, how many carb choices should you have per meal. And so when those who have diabetes are kind of just told to reduce their carbs or do keto, that can be very confusing and very overwhelming. So that is one of my biggest struggles with practitioners prescribing this diet for diabetes, because truthfully it can help. Research has shown that doing low carb and or keto can show improvements in your blood glucose levels and your A1C, which is kind of a snapshot of how your blood sugars have been over the past 3 months. So it's hard to say if this diet does help with type 2 diabetes. The food we eat directly correlates to our blood sugars, and so diabetes can be handled very effectively if done the right way. So that is why it's so important to work with a dietitian if you do have diabetes, so you can figure out what foods are increasing your sugars, which foods help to stabilize your blood sugars. Just being told to follow X diet with no further guidance is often not helpful. So in our podcast that I mentioned earlier, we do touch a lot more on the keto diet and sports performance, because that is also a very hot topic right now as well. If athletes, whether for cardiovascular or endurance events or more for strength or muscle building events, should be following this diet for more benefits. But basically the answer is the usual. It's controversial, it's conflicting. So to hear more, check out the podcast episode, but I'll kind of just leave it at that for now. So I have already touched on a few of the negatives of this diet, but I do have a couple more that I want to mention. But real quick, I gotta take a picture of my dog. Okay, I'm back. All right, I already mentioned constipation. This diet is typically pretty low in our high fiber foods like legumes and beans and peas and our whole grains. So again, might have some pooping struggles on this diet. You may have also heard of the keto flu. That is another typical complaint when following this diet. And this usually consists of symptoms like brain fog and headaches and fatigue. And this usually starts to happen when you are first starting this diet. And this is because, like I've kind of mentioned earlier, our body is not used to using ketones for energy. It wants to use glycogen, it wants to use carbs. It's trying really hard to perform optimally without the right nutrients, and that's why you kind of feel like crap when you first start this diet. Ketosis really is more of a backup strategy for just typical performance and staying alive. And so our body has to fight pretty hard to function the right way using just ketones instead of carbs. So that's usually why you feel kind of when you're doing this diet. I already mentioned as well that this diet can lead to high cholesterol and high triglyceride levels, which can have a negative impact on your heart health. And this is just due to the typically high levels of saturated fat that is being consumed on this diet. So no bueno there really either. Another negative of this diet I haven't really gotten to much yet is that protein is limited. I've talked a lot about fat, a lot about carbs, but what about protein on this diet? It really can only be a moderate amount of protein, because if you are doing too much protein, our body will use that instead of carbs for energy through a process called gluconeogenesis. And so fat really is our very last source of energy our body wants to use. Our body's gonna use carbs first, then protein, and then fat. And so if you're eating too much protein, our body's gonna go for that first instead of using those ketones. And when we limit protein and we're trying to lose weight, we risk losing more muscle mass, which I had mentioned earlier is not optimal. When losing weight, we wanna keep as much muscle mass on as we can to help keep our metabolism up and running at tip-top shape. So keto, if done properly, is again, super high fat, moderate protein, very low carbs. And if we don't get the carbs and the protein ratios right, we're not gonna be in ketosis. We're not gonna use ketones for energy. And the diet isn't gonna work as effectively as it should. And then the very last con I wanna point out about this diet is that it is very restrictive, like I've already touched on a couple times in this video. You're removing an entire macronutrient, one that we're supposed to be eating most of our calories from. I have seen in so many of my patients and clients this fear around carbs in general. They like talk about bread like it's eating it is a sin. And that's not the case. You can absolutely have bread or rice or pasta and still reach your fat loss goals. Just the amount of fear that following this diet can lead to is just so disruptive, and it makes me really sad when people I work with don't really believe when I say they can have carbs. They're like kind of in shock for a few weeks, and I see them next time and they're like, are you sure I can have bread? I'm like, yeah, you're good, have your bread, it's gonna be fine. That fear is not helpful, it's not gonna get you anywhere. And again, I know not everyone has these disordered eating thoughts when doing any kind of diet. I just see it so frequently that it makes me sad, it makes me a little nervous when people do start doing these kind of diets, because they do so often lead to just fear around food in general. Okay, I know that was kind of a lot. I have no idea how long this video is gonna be, but I feel like I've been talking for like 2 hours. I just wanna wrap up by saying, if this diet works for you, it's gonna work long term. That is awesome, go for it. You are in charge of what you're feeding yourself and what you do to your body. So if you love it, go for it. I'm proud of you. If you have done this diet and it hasn't gone so great, you didn't fail. The diet failed you. It was set up to be very restrictive. It wasn't even made for weight loss. And so if this hasn't worked for you, that's okay. But now would be a good time to start reintroducing those foods that you have had so much fear around in the past. Because all foods can and should be enjoyed in moderation. There's no food off limits. There's no one single food that's gonna lead to weight gain, weight loss, diabetes, cardiovascular health. It is so much more about big picture than it is your tiny little microscopic meal choices from day to day. The best diet for you is one that you can stick with long term and one that you actually enjoy. I have seen some people do well with keto because they don't really enjoy things like bread and potatoes and pasta, so they're cool with not having those foods every day. But if you're like me and those foods are a staple and you like having variety and not having rules, keto may not be a good fit for you. So I always want to make that clear with every diet that I kind of review on here, is that if it works, great, but I'm a big fan of no food rules. Eat whatever the heck you want. You can meet your goals eating really anything. Let me know below what you guys thought of this video. If you have any more questions about this diet, let me know below as well. And let me know what you want me to review next. I have a good time talking about these types of diets and kind of the pros and the cons, and really breaking down the science behind them. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.